Hey folks, Steve here with a review video at last for Fall of the Third Reich, published by Compass Games, designed by Ted Raicer. We finished up our playthrough video series recently, and I have finally gotten the time to record a review video. So just right off the back, a little bit of background for the game. This is a game that is, we'll say, strategic level with an operational feel, covering the European theater of operations, World War II, from 1943 through to the end of the war, and can be played either as a two-player game, a three-player game, or a four-player game, where you're divvying up the sort of fronts, and sides like the Soviets and the Western Allies can be played by separate players. I played it solitaire for this review, so this review has a weakness in that way, that it does not have an opposed aspect of my experience incorporated into it, but I think based on my solitaire play, which you can watch elsewhere on the channel, I think it worked out okay. I got a good feel for the game. So we'll go with that in mind as we talk through the video. If you're really interested in seeing the game in depth, you can watch that series. It's quite long. I think it was like an hour per turn for much of it, so unless you've got 12 hours to spare, you may not be able to watch all of that. But the way that I'm going to have this video structured is we have this introduction here. We'll cut it over to a more zoomed in view of the game, the components, and the game mechanics, which I'll explain, and then at the very end of the video we will talk through my thoughts, opinions, and whether or not I can recommend the game. If you'd like to skip to that and just cut to the chase, I will show you the timestamp here in the transition, so you can just skip to that part if that's all you really care about. If you want to see the rest of the game in greater depth and you kind of want to understand how things work, then stick around and we'll go into that in-depth discussion. Again, just some of the highlights of this. It is strictly a July-August 1943, that is turn 1, through to May-June 1945. For me, I had picked this game up because of playing World in Flames and basically reaching a conclusion of, boy, I don't get to see the Allies pushing back into Europe very often, just the way the campaigns go. It'd be fun to have a game that is focused purely on that, and this game does do that. That is the design intent of the game. It's not trying to be anything but that, and that is sort of its wheelhouse. The other thing I'll just make sure to say before we move on any further, that this is not related to Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, a game from the 80s which has become a World at War published by GMT Games. It's sort of like the current version of that system. This is a totally different game, totally different system, not at all related. Ted Raicer is the designer for this. Make sure that's clear so that folks don't get confused and start thinking about that other game. So, I think that's it for the intro. Let's take a closer look at the game, or again, in the transition, you can skip to the real part of the review. Okay, so let's talk game mechanics at a really high level so that folks understand the way the game works. Basically, the game operates on an I go, you go system, one side getting its main set of phases and actions, and the other side then getting to go. But the game mixes it up a little bit by providing for different phases sort of slicing into those main activities. So in any given turn, you're going to have your typical reinforcements and replacements that are common in war games, where new forces will come in on certain turns. You will get a certain amount of replacement points that can be used to replenish eliminated units or reduced units. And then there's a few other phases in there, but what will start to happen in a game turn is there is an Allied invasion phase, which I'll talk about in a moment. Then the Axis gets to have sort of its main phases where it's determining where it's going to focus on and doing its movement and doing its combat. The opposite side, the Allies and Soviets, get to do a reaction phase, which is a very very limited sort of counter move, and it is truly very limited. You can maybe move a few units in response to a lot of activity, and then that side that originated the action at the Axis gets to do exploitation movement. So their mechanized units will be able to do some additional movement, but there are some restrictions on that, and I'll talk about the movement here in another minute. When you get to the end of that part of the turn, it sort of reverses. So the Allies and the Soviets get their main action phase of movement and combat. The Axis gets to react a little bit, and then the Allies get their exploitation phase with mechanized units. The additional strategic level phases are a large abstraction of the concept. So there are air forces that can provide a number of different types of missions. So you can see here's an example of the 15th Air Force. That air unit can be set to disrupt Axis operations for strategic movement, can bomb factories to reduce replacement rates, can bomb or attack oil reserves, which will limit the command ability of the Axis, which we'll talk about, and can do other things like supporting combats. And that's done in a very simple way. The Allies will designate what their air forces are going to do. They can have up to 3 different Air Force sort of units and designations, and the Axis will have Luftwaffe markers that they'll have designated to the different fronts doing different things, but for the most part is really just there to contest the Allied bombing for a specific purpose. So it's really straightforward. It really comes down to rolling a d6, checking a few modifiers, and then applying the results. Now, the way the game is set up is, and I'll zoom out for a second so you can see, the game is really set up and structured into 4 different theaters. There's a northwestern theater up here, which comprises of Western Germany and France, or most of France for the most part. There's a Mediterranean theater, which covers sort of the southeastern corner of France and Italy. There is a Balkan front, which covers the Balkans, nothing too crazy there. And then there's an eastern front that covers Eastern Germany off into the Soviet Union. And really, the game is really kind of structured around those fronts. There's not a huge number of rules sort of governing what you can and can't do in those, except for a few areas like the Western Allies. If somehow they got to the Eastern Front, it's kind of, there's some restrictions on what they can do, and the Soviets can't really operate in the Mediterranean theater. Some of these being a little bit of maybe like, they seem like really specific restrictions, but they ultimately probably won't influence your game very much if you're playing. I have on screen here some example units. So the basic structure of the game is hex and counter. You're going to be using units to traverse terrain, setting up attacks, and comparing combat ratios like in most hex and counter war games. I have a nice assortment of different kinds of units here. This is a specialty unit that comes in on conditional circumstances, so some reinforcements are based on conditions, not a turn number. And in this case, this is an Italian unit that can come in when the main Italian force surrenders. And there's some special rules governing that, but it's a relatively straightforward process. The British and the Americans, all of their units are mechanized. Hopefully you can see the mechanized infantry NATO symbol there, and their units are usually the same combat strength, and these are structured, as you might guess, in a lot of war games, an attack factor, a defense factor, and a movement factor. And these forces tend to be 2 steps, but when they're on the reverse step, they don't have any attack capability, though they can defend, and those are pretty good combat factors for defense. The Western Allies also have paratroopers, which can be used flipped over like this to support an invasion, which we'll talk about. Otherwise, they have a 2 combat factor on attack or defense and a 4 movement. The Soviets over here will have units something like this. They either have an infantry unit that's relatively weak, a mechanized unit that's sort of in the middle, and then an armor guard tank army or something to that effect that is quite stronger, 7 attack, 5 defense factor, 8 movement. The real oddity is the Germans, and the vast majority of their units have letter designations. And I guess now is a good time to point out that the other Axis minor units, like the Italians, will have relatively weak number designated combat factors. So this is really just a German thing. have letter designation. So you can see here there's a C infantry, a B infantry, and an A armor unit, tank unit, panzer, however you want to refer to it. So while the second number is a movement factor, 8, 4, and 4, what you'll end up doing is rolling on a chart that determines what strength that unit is going to provide to a combat in any given combat. So before combat, you roll sort of a preliminary die, and that will dictate whether those units use the worst result for their letter designation, the middle result, or the best result. So the highest an A can have, for instance, is an 8. The highest the B can have is a 6. The highest the C can have is a 4. And you can see there's some ranges there, but on the weaker end, an A can be as weak as a 4, a B as weak as a 3, and a C as weak as a 2. So there's sort of an element of unknown. You can't guarantee that what you're attacking is going, what you're attacking with or what you're defending with, as the Germans, for instance, will be strong enough or weak enough or whatever for the exact nature of the combat to kind of become known. And it just represents, you don't know how well these units are really going to perform. They're untested in some ways. And so there is some variation there. And you have to build that into your strategy and where you attack and what you attack with. And what could be, potentially 4-to-1 odds might very quickly become 2-to-1 odds if the Germans roll very high. And where they set their Luftwaffe markers, for instance, can help influence that die roll. So there's a few things there that can help or hurt you when you're playing the game with these German units, and you have to account for it. Now, most Soviet units are single-step, so if they take a loss, they're gone, even a strong guard tank army like that. The Western Allies are all mostly two-step units, except for the paratroopers, which are one-step. And then the German units will depend. A C-rated is usually a one-stepper. A B is usually a two-step, and so is an A. So part of what comes into play when you're doing replacements is deciding, am I going to spend 2 replacements to bring back a B-rated unit or an A-rated unit at full strength, or am I going to spend 2 replacement points to bring back 2 C-rated units because they're one step? And I can imagine some cases where, you might need to pick one or the other, depending on what front they're going to go to and all of that good stuff. The combat results table is actually pretty interesting. There are some unique aspects to it. For instance, the chart maxes out at 5-to-1 odds, which guarantees that the defender will be eliminated. And on the lower end, anything lower than 1-to-2 odds will be attacker eliminated. And there are things that kind of factor into that. So, you can see a column shift if there's a fort in a particular hex that the defender is in. Some of the air mechanics can allow for a shift to the right, like carpet bombing as a particular hex for combat will allow you to shift to the right. So that sort of, you can imagine you might do carpet bombing on a fort that you're attacking in order to nullify the column shifts and guarantee success or something like that. The one interesting thing is this game has a odds differential bit to it. So not just an odds, but when you reach a certain odds level, you are instead looking at how many factors beyond the defender do you have until you get up to 2-to-1 odds. So it does mean that there is potentially a reason to attack, even if you don't have 2-to-1 odds. If you at least have something greater than the defender, then you have an incentive to attack still. So, a lot of hex and counter games come down to figuring out odds values and are the ratios right, and you're trying to count off. Even this game provides a mechanism by which, even those attacks, if you can't quite get the right fraction, it might still be a good attack or a decent enough attack that it's worth pursuing. Now, the one interesting rule, and I've seen Ted use this rule in other games of his, and it's always kind of a weird one to wrap your head around, that the way the game is structured, and I'll just sort of set up a fake situation to help illustrate, you cannot do multi-hex attacks unless, basically all the attackers or the additional attackers are free to do so. I guess that's the simplest way to explain it. Meaning, I cannot have both of these allied units attack this unit unless these 2 other units are being attacked by units that are not that British unit, right? That's sort of the way to look at it.
So you can definitely do one-to-one. And in fact, on the East Front, for instance, you may find in a lot of situations you're doing one hex to one hex combats. Now, you can stack, it's usually up to 3 units per hex. So you can get 3 units there and attack from that one hex to another hex. And that's where you're going to get probably the best attacks you can get without doing a multi-hex attack. Where the multi-hex attacks really come in is once you've sort of broken a line. So in this example, these 2 German units could attack that British unit because these, if we ignore the Soviets for a second, these 2 units are not adjacent to any other Allied units. They don't have any other Allied units in their zones of control. They're sort of free or freed up. They're not distracted by other units on the front line that they can concentrate an attack on this unit. It makes sense, but it is different from many typical hex encounter war games that you've likely played or seen. It's a little bit different. Again, I've seen Ted use this mechanic in a couple other games. It makes sense, but if you're new to it, it takes a second for you to wrap your head around. Now, terrain is in this game, but how movement works is kind of interesting. You are basically, when you're doing your main action activity, every hex is effectively worth 1 movement point. Even things like mountains. This is to sort of cover the fact that often these turns are representing, basically 2 months, or usually 2 months. Or I guess in every case it's 2 months. So in 2 months, that unit should be able to get up here from like down here. Given 8 movement points across 2 months, they can get, to some destination. So you really have this huge sort of flexibility in where you can go and where you can get to when it's your main activity. You still have to watch out for enemy Zocs. So like in most hex encounter war games, if you enter a Zoc, you have to stop moving. And you really can't move from enemy Zoc to enemy Zoc, which means that you could have units sort of locked up or trapped. And it's really hard to save units in that position because of a Zoc situation. Where the terrain matters typically then is for combat. So if you're defending in a mountain hex, you're going to get a few extra defensive factors, which will then make it harder for the attacker to have a good odds ratio. And then the other piece of it is for exploitation and reaction movement. So when I mentioned there's those little reactions you can do and the exploitation phase with mechanized units, there is a whole separate sort of terrain category between the sort of like normal turn movement, where by and large it's 1 movement per hex, and the exploitation, where you would see your more typical like rough or mountain is going to be much harder to move through. It's going to cost multiple movement points. So you'll have maybe a tank unit in the main movement phase will be able to move pretty far because they're getting to where the new front line is. They're able to operate and attack and do whatever. But when you're doing that great exploitation because you broke through the enemy line, depending on that terrain, you still might not get very far. There's not going to be these huge, gigantic encirclements the size of Poland or something very often. Or if you do that, you're putting your spearhead at a lot of risk in this game. Because you have that sort of back and forth rhythm of I do my main thing, you do a little bit, and then I do more, you can have situations where if you're over-eager, your spearhead can be cut out of supply and eliminated relatively easily. So it's not, to my mind, I don't see a situation where you have like, one single breakthrough is going to mean a huge amount of operations in the backfield, because that spearhead via one little outbreak will probably be contained until your defensive line has been shot to hell and you don't have much left to defend with. Case in point, Germany at the end of my playthrough, which is, you guys can see here, this is the end result of my playthrough. That's really the broad strokes of the game. So there's a few other things around strategic movement. The only other thing really worth calling out are the invasions, and the game does have a specialized system to govern invasions. You can kind of see here on the map, in several places there's these sort of triangle shapes on the coastlines. That is this game's sort of marcation for where invasions are allowed to be performed, and makes basically the assumption that these areas have beaches that are more suitable for amphibious landings. Other games do that sort of thing. They're doing that here, where there are very specifically a numbered set of hexes that you can do an invasion in. Now here's an example that I have for what is referred to as invasion point I. This is marked with an AL, which means you need to use an AL beachhead marker. So this is a beachhead marker. You place that at the beginning of the turn, or the early parts of the turn. There's a specific invasion phase. And you have to make sure your beachhead marker that you're using matches the triangle placement. So if it's CW, you have to use a CW marker. If it's US, you have to use a US marker. And if it's AL, you have to use an AL marker. It's really just differentiating how the Allies chose to invade particular locations. So here is an AL marker. So I would place that here. I'm going to designate some units that are going to be performing that invasion. And then what you do is, instead of rolling a combat, there's a specific invasion table that you roll on. You factor in things like terrain. Here it's clear, so that's good. And then you also determine modifiers like, is there anyone defending there? So a German unit here would provide a malus to the die roll. If it's a mechanized unit, then it's even better for the Germans. That penalty to the die roll is greater. And there are things that the Allies can do to ensure support there. There's an aspect of air support, so you trace a certain number of hexes, I believe it's 4, back to an Allied air trace space or a controlled city or town. And that can provide some additional modifiers that can often mean, if you're attacking an undefended beach, almost guaranteed success of an invasion. But as folks saw in my playthrough video, if you don't have the right mix of modifiers and you roll badly, then that can set you back quite a bit. And units can be reduced and stuck here on the beachhead. Sometimes you can force the defender to retreat and you can take a step loss. And in other times, you take a step loss and the whole invasion fails, and you all go back to a holding box for the front. And obviously, the Western Allies are really well connected to the invasion mechanic, where they kind of have to decide, where are we going to invade, with what, and will it be enough to push back the Germans and the Axis forces, wherever you're happening to target. Now, there are some interesting bits in terms of the command structure of the game. So what really differentiates this game from your typical hex encounter is that the Soviets and the Axis operate on a command mechanic, while the Western Allies operate on we'll say a supply port mechanic. Kind of hard to explain. So, in terms of the command, basically the Germans, depending on if any oil bombing occurred, will have access to a certain number of OKW or OKH markers, and they'll divvy up sort of a point value across the west and the east, or OKW versus OKH, and they will place those markers in towns or cities they control. Cities are better than towns and will double the marker's value. So if you put a 3 marker in a city, it will effectively operate as a 6, and that means that German Axis units within 6 hexes of that city with the marker will be able to attack, will be able to retreat out of, infantry units be able to retreat away from enemy Zocs, and it's basically sort of the linchpin of what they're going to do in their turn is where they put these command markers. The Soviets work very similar to that, where they will always get 4 different markers, all ranging 1, 2, 3, and 4 value. Those placed in cities are worth double, same as the Axis, and they basically operate the same way. Those units in range of those markers will be able to attack, retreat out of Zocs, etc. Now, that command structure is separate from supply, so Axis and Soviet units will need to count either 4 hexes back to a controlled town or 8 hexes back to a controlled city that can then trace a line of communication back to an ultimate supply source. For the Germans, it's these special factory hexes that are in Germany. For the Soviets, it's the eastern map edge. So there is a difference between supply and command, but it's relatively easy to keep them separate. What's very odd is for the Western Allies, it's almost like the inverse. What the Allies get are chafe markers, and they also number 1, 2, 3, and 4, and they are placed either in beachheads or controlled port port towns or port cities. And the way it kind of works is that the Western Allies are basically can be considered to always be in command, meaning they can always attack, assuming they're full strength and they don't have a 0 combat factor. And they are all mechanized, which means like leaving Zox isn't such a big deal for the most part, and they can all do exploitation movement. What their limiting factor is supply. And what's different there is that the chafe markers, again placed in the beachhead markers or the ports, will extend supply out a certain number of hexes based on where the marker is. So if it's based on a beachhead marker, that's like a 2 times multiplier, so a 4 marker times 2 is 8. You can count 8 hexes away. Those units will be in supply. If you put it in a port city, it's also times 2. If it's just in a port town, it's a times 1 multiplier. And then there are a set of specialty cities on the map in Naples and Marseille, which are times 4 multipliers, and Antwerp, which is a times 5 multiplier. What that does, and it's a bit of an odd thing, is the Allies really are going to be looking at those ports and determining how they're going to advance. And that may mean that, if they land in Sicily, then the next big step's going to get to Naples, which will give them supply out this way, and then maybe they're looking at getting Marseille to sort of have supply out here. And when they land in France, they're going to stick towards the coast and operate, start heading southeast, but eventually they'll want to pick up Antwerp to project supply all kind of through northwestern Europe. And if you are trying to move outside of that supply range, then you're going to start running into attrition issues and units are getting eliminated. So the Western Allies are really kind of stuck into a coastal thing. And one of the oddities really of the system means like if the Allies capture Paris, they can't really use Paris as a secondary supply depot kind of thing. You are reliant on those coasts and you're reliant on those ports, and it is weird. And I'm used to World in Flames, so I have this idea of how you kind of have a way to get supply through certain areas. This game is just operating under a very different sort of assumption or mechanism to drive the action, and it does mean you're going to have the weird stuff, and I covered this in my playthrough video, but I'll repeat here for those who didn't watch, that there's a point where Allied supply can't get through northern Italy into southern Germany. So even if you do very well there, which historically didn't necessarily happen, the Allies didn't get up to the Alps, they didn't cross into southern Germany there. If for some reason you were able to get that far, the game won't let you cross over into southern Germany, or you'll only be able to get so far before you're out of supply if you don't have Antwerp. And there's a lot of different abstract reasons as to why the game might be designed that way. It drives certain behavior, but that might end up being a little too railroady for some folks, and it might break your immersion a little bit. And I'm kind of okay with it because most of the game really doesn't feel like that. You don't run into those weird constraints very often, but when they do show up, that may bother you a little bit. The game is structured then from there to basically cause the fall of the Third Reich. So each side are performing all these activities, combats, invasions, driving to get to Germany and achieve a victory condition. There are several different victory conditions. There are some that are automatic victories for the Axis. They usually mean slowing down the Allies on one of the major fronts way past a historical timetable, and we would you just call that an Axis victory. The other ways are obviously if the Allies do very well in a particular theater, that may trigger an automatic victory, but otherwise you are fighting to take the really critical industrial hexes of Germany, which are located in Essen, Dortmund, Berlin, and the Upper Silesian industrial region. Either doing that or getting as many capturing victory hex cities, as many as possible to reach a certain threshold. Those are marked in red on the map. They're in places that more or less make sense as important, strategically important areas or politically important areas. So I don't, there's no shockers in any of that in terms of, what is this supposed to represent? And yeah, you're trying to cause the fall of the Third Reich. You're trying to liberate Europe, or take control of Europe, however you want to view that in light of the Soviets and things they did. So there you go. So yeah, 12 turns. The game it probably would play maybe an hour per turn, so you could get this played in a very long day, or maybe in a couple sessions across 2 days or something like that. I think that's all I wanted to cover for the basic mechanics of the game. Obviously, this is no substitute for the rulebook and actually, getting through the game. There's nuances to take note of and special rules for minor countries, but hopefully that gives folks a basic idea of how the game plays. Let's kick it back over to the end part of the video and the true review.
Okay, so what did I think of the game? Well, I'll say this. I don't think this is my favorite Ted Raicer game, though I don't think it's a bad game. So, the components, for the most part, are fine. The counters are good standard quality. The map, as a paper map, is fine. I don't have any issue with paper maps at all. I did run into issues in my playthrough differentiating some of the terrain here, and in particular some issues with the way that the rivers were printed. At least to my eyes, and maybe it's the lighting of the room that caused me some grief, but trying to make a distinction between a major river and a minor river, it wasn't always a very easy call, which I don't usually have that problem in games, but here I did, and that was frustrating. In a few spots where it might have mattered. The overall game mechanics, I think, work fine. The I go, you go system, I mean, that's pretty standard, no issues there. I do like the reaction and exploitation segments and sort of, what you can do. It's not like you're completely unable to respond to 2 months of your opponent's activities in a given front. I like that. That is good. It allows for a little bit more interactivity through the turn, though folks are going to have to make sure they look at the sequence of play and really, break it down. Okay, now we're at this step, let's, take care of that. I had mentioned in the gameplay details and in my own playthrough that there are some oddities in terms of the way the supply system is structured for the Western Allies that can lead to some immersion issues. I know that for people who are watching my playthrough were kind of bothered by that, and I do get it. That might bother you, and it really principally comes down to, could the Western Allies, if they had taken northern Italy, could they have come into southern Germany via Italy? I think it's conceivable they could have done that. It's hard for me to say. I'm not sure how well, I'm not well read on that what-if situation, but the game kind of says, well, they wouldn't have done that, or right now the game is designed as such that they can't do that. And that might bother some people, and I totally get why that would bother you. So, something to consider when it comes to this game. In terms of play balance, I definitely get folks saying it's really hard for the Axis, but my singular solitaire game is just the one solitaire game, so I think if I did a whole replay of this, I maybe could have done better as the Axis, but there's certainly, I think the challenge is on the Axis player. So if you're going to play this with a buddy, the Axis player should know that they're on the defense the whole game. They are going to have to be crafty in pulling back and when to hold and where to hold, where are they going to establish the defensive lines in the East Front or in the West Front even. I mean, just anywhere. The Balkans may be more important than you think in terms of, are you going to try to wrap something up there early and keep the Allies from having too many freebies down there. I think all that kind of stuff really matters. And so, there's certainly a strategic aspect of this where the Allies probably don't have as much, space to have to travel to be competent. Like their forces are good, their replacement rates are pretty good. They can make some mistakes and make up for it. It kind of feels like as the Axis, you really can't afford to make very many mistakes. Now, some of that is just historical, and I think that is going to be the one thing for people they have to acknowledge about the game. The game is called Fall of the Third Reich. It is not Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. It's not the maybe the Third Reich is going to stick around for a while game. It's the Fall of the Third Reich. The Third Reich will fall in this game. Your goal as the Axis player is to make that take as long as possible. Maybe you try to achieve an automatic victory by pulling off something really funky against the Western Allies or the Soviets via some mechanism. It's entirely possible for people to do that. I had read that was done. But it is going to be the challenge for you for sure. What is very difficult to say in a review like this is I think this game could gain a lot from having a second edition. And I say it's unfortunate because a game, if it doesn't have a really good first edition, might not get to see a second edition. But I think this game would do better if it got a second look. And my recommendations for that, if they matter at all, would be to clean up some of the map art to make those rivers much more intelligible. Make sure that the actual hex terrain colorization is clearer than it is now. For the most part, it's fine. But that would be a refinement. There's a few bits of map errata that could be fixed up pretty simply and weren't really a big deal for me. And then, an opportunity to reevaluate maybe some of the systems and, decide things from there. So it's not to say that the first edition is a bad product, but I think if the game got a second life and got a second edition or maybe an update kit or something to kind of help bring it together a little more cohesively, I think the game would gain a lot by doing that. And I do think it deserves it. And what's going to be tough is that, people are going to look at this review, they're going to interpret it, and yeah, like I said, it's not my favorite Ted Raicer game. But I did have fun with it, and that is, in theory, the most important part of the puzzle, isn't it? I had fun playing it as a solo game, as an experiment to try out the system. I liked it. I did like it. But there are things about it that I did scratch my head a little bit on, and like I said, may rub people the wrong way. Now the game is still available from Compass Games as of this recording, so it's available. Typically games wouldn't see a second edition until the first edition is sold out, and all of that. So if you're waiting around for a second edition, it might not ever happen. But if you're sitting there saying, hey, you know what, I play a lot of games, I don't have a game about the fall of the Third Reich, or basically 43 to 45, and I want a game, I can tentatively recommend this game to you. It includes Italy, and there are other games that cover similar topics that do not include Italy, so if having Italy in the game is an important piece of the puzzle for you, then that's a great reason to look at this game as well. There are other games like, Mighty Endeavor, which really cover just the landings in France, and with the expanded edition, the East Front, when they're in like Poland or something. But it doesn't have Italy, right? So, if you don't care about Italy, maybe play a game like that. If you do want to see Italy in the game and you want to experience some of that, that's one of the things that this game offers you. There are other games that are like this. I think one's called Festum Europa. It might also be by Compass Games. I can't remember. There's a few other titles that are like this. Having not played those, I can't make a comparison. But for the money I spent for this game and for the fun I had with it, it was worth it to me. So, in terms of a rating, and I'm always kind of cautious about those because it's hard to really make anything meaningful out of that. It's 7.5 for me, something like that. It's a competently made game. It makes some design decisions that are going to be different, that there are going to be the unique aspects of understanding how to manage command, how to manage supply, that in other games you might just simply handle a different way. Your success in playing the game will be tied to learning those new systems that you might not be as familiar with, and whether or not you think those systems are good simulations or they're good game mechanics. Ponder those thoughts before you buy the game. That may be what pushes you one way or the other. So, a tentative recommendation, I did like the game. I realize it won't be for everybody. But I hope that this game gets some more engagement, that more people try it out and see how it goes, and maybe we'll see that second edition someday that will help spruce it up a little bit more. It could use some more play rate charts too. The play rate charts provided were fine. They were helpful, they were clear. It might have been nice to have an extra copy of one or two of them if you were playing for 2 players. Single player, it was no big deal, but I could see where you've got to pass the player aid charts back and forth. So that kind of stuff in a second edition would help a lot if we ever see it. So there you go, guys. Kind of a long time coming, I know. I've had this game for a while. I'm glad I got to play it. I did have fun. May not be for everybody, but if you're really curious, you can watch my playthrough series and decide for yourself if this is something you want to give it a go on. So thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit like. If you want to see more stuff, subscribe. The next game on the list to look at is going to be Korea Fire and Ice, and will be coming up in the next couple of weeks, I guess. We'll see how fast I can get stuff going for it. So until then, take care, guys. Keep on gaming.